Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. I'm going to talk about the Hamilton Community Benefits Network and our journey so far. And as I begin to talk about our building the coalition and some of our partners and members, we have to acknowledge the debt of gratitude we owe to the Toronto Community Benefits Network. They really gave us a massive running start in terms of their experience in helping us out early on in our organizing, our engagement. We even stole some of their bylaws and and used them. So they were very much instrumental in helping us out, and I really need to acknowledge that first and forthright. So I'm going to talk about how we started. About 20 months ago, it became evident that the Hamilton LRT project was finally, after 8 years at that point, was going to be moving forward, and there was a need for an organization to help negotiate with Metrolinx a community benefits agreement. We naturally looked to Toronto, as I said, as a model to assist us, and with a $10,000 startup grant from the Atkinson Foundation, we hit the ground running and started to organize and galvanize political support. Now, we had a little bit of an advantage in Hamilton in that we had strong support from the Hamilton District Labour Council and the Building Trades Council, as well as an experiment that had been going on in what was called the Neighbourhood Action Strategy in Hamilton, which took the 11 poorest neighbourhoods in the city and tried to, with support of both City Council and the Hamilton Community Foundations, organize them into entities that did their own grassroots community engagement. So we had of the small governance. Hamilton also has a rich history of local neighborhood governance, although that doesn't necessarily always include the most marginalized of our society. So we had the pieces were already starting to be there to form this. Now, that doesn't mean it was still easy, but at least we had a head start over like our friends in Halton, in that there were already these organizations that were already thinking about community and actively engaged. And as I said, we had heavy support from labor in Hamilton due to the heavy labor background in our city. So what we did from there is we started hosting meetings after meetings after meetings. I think it was every 2 weeks for almost 10 months. We sent out invites to every group that we could think of and some that we didn't, and then depended on some of our partners to reach out to their networks to bring together as many organizations as we could, to the point where the Hamilton Community Benefits Network now represents about 100,000 people in the city of Hamilton, which comes in handy later on, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So we were able to bring together divergent groups that sometimes wouldn't talk to each other. So Acorn Hamilton and the Tenant Solidarity Network, the Chamber of Commerce is also sitting with us and a vested interest in BIAs and business supports. So we built a broad coalition, but wanting to keep in mind that we wanted to keep things at the grassroots. We wanted to make sure that the lowest members of our organization at the community level had their voice amplified at the table at Metrolinx. And that was something that was very keen on us from the outset. So we built this broad coalition. We set out to incorporate, and we had our first AGM exactly 1 year ago, and then we hit the ground running. Again, strictly as volunteers. As mentioned, funding is always an issue when you're a not-for-profit. So for the most part, other than in-kind donations from the Hamilton Brantford Building Trades, who was generous enough to donate Mark, our president, to us for about 20 hours a week. We have been all volunteer driven. So what we did after building this coalition and engaging as many of the voices as we could in the city of Hamilton, we started talking with Metrolinx about the Hamilton LRT project. Now, the Hamilton LRT project is unique. It's a $1.3 billion project that required the expropriation or purchase of 91 properties, including residential properties, in the densest part of the city. So there was no right of way. This is carving a path right through the middle of the city. If you can imagine, take King Street in Toronto and then run an LRT line down the middle of it. So it was a massive challenge. It's also one of our most socioeconomically repressed areas in the city of Hamilton. It contains a great deal of poverty, especially child poverty rates. So this was a very, very a difficult project to negotiate with Metrolinx in some of the community challenges. There's also a lot of political uncertainty. If you take a look at the chart of the perceptions of the build, you can see the Eglinton, here, Ontario, Hamilton, and Finch West. And you'll notice awareness of the project is very high in Hamilton. Support for the project, not so much. Coming in at 59% along the line, and citywide only about 42% in some polls. So there hasn't been a lot of communication to to Hamilton because it's a very divided city. Although we were very blessed to have a broad coalition that we formed, our city is very divided along east, west, and mountain and suburb and inner city regions. So that presented a great deal of challenges in moving the project forward. So right now we are at the RFP where it says summer 2018. That actually got delayed to fall. So the RFP has been released. 3 companies are bidding to become the project co that will ultimately get the contract to build this line. We have had several meetings with Metrolinx laying out introductories meetings. Unfortunately, things have been on hold between the provincial election and our pending municipal election, so there hasn't been a lot of forward movement. Metrolinx has kind of been in a caretaking holding mode around the project and waiting to see what's happening with the new government. But I want to talk about some of the things that we are hoping to get out of a community benefits, building on Toronto's success. So we are aiming a little bit higher and looking at between 15 and 20% total employment as a pipeline to employment of our most marginalized. Now our demographics are a little bit different in the city of Hamilton than the city of Toronto in terms of the groups, but we will be very similar types of groups that we'll be targeting. And we're looking at both the union trades and the professional, administrative, and technical jobs as part of that 20%. So whether that's 10 and 10 or 7 and 13, it will very much depend on negotiations with Project Co, but that's what we're looking at out of the gate. We are also, because of those 91 properties that have been procured for construction, Metrolinx is not used to being a property owner. They are now sitting on a bunch of property that is sitting on a transit corridor which has an immense uplift potential. That is to say that once the LRT line is built, those lands are going to be worth far more than Metrolinx paid for them initially. So one of our key issues, and one of the key issues in Hamilton, is social and affordable housing. So we're looking at how and what ways we can use our community partners and our political power to get Metrolinx to do something with that land other than just reselling it to developers, and whether that's mixed-use commercial, donations to Hamilton City Housing. We're not sure how that looks like, but Metrolinx has already indicated very early on that they are interested in working on ways with this property. We're also keenly aware of the need for community or hub space. So like I said, we have a very organized set of community groups in Hamilton that represent a lot of the neighborhoods, but they have nowhere to meet, especially nowhere spaces that are accessible. So community hub spaces we're definitely interested in, and we're interested in seeing what we can leverage in the operation and maintenance facility itself. It's a giant building that they're constructing there. It's about $130 million, I believe, for the O&M facility, and there's going to be a lot of extra space. We'd like to see what can be done with that. Local stakeholders and neighborhood residents are really keen on talking specifically about art projects. Because of those 91 properties that have been procured, there's also been a series of landlords and owners across the LRT line that have started boarding up their buildings in anticipation of property uplift and resale of those properties. So right now there are stretches along the LRT line that are quite boarded up. It's actually quite a bit of an eyesore. So we've been working on them to figure out what can be done with these vacant buildings in terms of animating them with community space. And then once the buildings are torn down before the construction takes place, what are the potentials for those vacant lots in terms of community access, pop-up parks? We're looking at engagement with them because large sections of the major intersection in Hamilton will be blocked off for up to 6 month periods. What can we do for festivals, street parties, all kinds of concerts on those blocked off streets during construction? We've been working with the BIA and the chambers on figuring out how to support business. It's one of the things that we learned from Toronto, is that the businesses are deeply affected by the construction and by wayfinding, and what ways can we get Project Co to make sure that their employees are eating at the local restaurants on the line and shopping on the local restaurant? What incentives can we do to bring people into these areas while they're boarded up and difficult to access? We've been working with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board and the Hamilton Art Gallery on some, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a bit, on engaging arts and public arts construction in the education, working with school boards. Project Co, we're hoping to ask them to implement food drives and staff volunteers for community projects, which we've seen from the Toronto Community Benefits Networks. Hamilton also has, and I'll just go back a bit, along this entire LRT corridor, there's almost a parallel series of alleys that are left over from the 20s when the the city was being built in a grid pattern that basically parallel most of that line. And we want to talk about what can be done with those alleyways and laneways in terms of animating them back into public spaces, turning them into cycle lanes, turning them into pop-up parks, rear entrances for businesses during construction. So that's one of the other key things that we're looking at that separates Hamilton from some of the other projects. Of course, Hamilton has a terrible, terrible legacy during any building project of community engagement. They barely pay. Public engagement theater is actually what it's been called by some activists in our city. And so what we want to do is make sure that we are magnifying the voices, not just of our network, but of the communities and of the people affected by this construction, to make sure that they have a voice and that the things that they're saying are being repeated right at the table with Metrolink staff, with City of Hamilton staff. And that goes on to say also to make sure that we've got resident and local stakeholder input on station design. Local people know how they use things the most, and we want to make sure that it's not just Project Co that just drops a generic station, that the same one that they're rolling out in every other community, and then a bunch of our community partners are like, well, actually that's the way that station faces isn't as accessible as it could be for people coming from this building here, or if the ramp were just slightly over somewhere else, it would be much more accessible. And those are the kind of small things and small wins that we think will cost nothing to Project Co. It could be something as simple as lighting. I'll give you an example. In the city of Hamilton, we had a new stadium that was built for the Pan Am Games, and for 6 months, the stadium lighting would not turn off. For whatever reason, during the installation of this stadium, no one had thought to put any off switches on the lights. As something as simple. So we had the entire community around 3 o'clock in the morning, blinding stadium lights that could not be turned off. So even the placement of lighting and bollards, something that simple, can have a dramatic effect on people's enjoyment in the community. And we want to look at making sure that we're talking about even the small stuff. So I'm going to go on to some of the quick wins so far. We're not very far down the process, as I said. The RFP hasn't even been issued. We're still in early stages. But we do have 2 key victories that I want to talk about today. The first is the Hamilton LRT Corridor Community Art Pilot Project. So as I identified, we had a problem along the line with all these boarded up buildings. They looked bad in the community, the residents it reflected poorly on the project, and it just was bringing the residents down. So we brought this on early on to Metrolinx, and Metrolinx agreed to give us $20,000 as a pilot to see what we could do with those buildings in terms of animating them, in terms of engaging the public. And what we did is we partnered with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, a couple of local artist collectives, a couple of artist not-for-profits, and the art gallery, and we are now rolling out, we're going to reanimate 4 buildings along the line with full public art that will be engaged with youth students as well as high school students, so a range of students on 4 different projects that will liven these things up with community projects that they can all point to and say, look at how I contributed, look at what happened in the line. So it brings the community closer to the project, as well as brightening up these spaces that have caused a lot of upset in the neighborhood. Our other quick win was we got the GIC, so our city council, to pass a motion to create a community benefits advisory subcommittee that reports back to council to talk about what a community benefits framework would look like beyond LRT. So we're looking, actually, and that'll be my next slide, we're looking beyond public projects, but also private sector projects. Hamilton is booming right now, which comes to my next point. We have seen a massive increase in development in the city, and it's showing no sign of slowing down if LRT continues. Hamilton has no history of using Section 37, period, for any public works projects. At this point, we are actually still actively subsidizing developers to come into our community, like we're the poor industrial city we were 5 or 10 years ago. So we want to change that, and the way that we've been able to do that so far to get the council to pass the motion, unanimously I might add, is by pointing to our member coalitions and reminding them that an election was coming. As I said, we do represent about 100,000 people in the city of Hamilton. We've got the power of labor as well as some business groups, community groups, and we were able to use that to push the city of Hamilton to start talking about community benefits and looking at them. We were also able to leverage that power in changes to the secondary plan in the city of Hamilton. A lot of those small community groups that were up there, they banded together and worked on pressuring the city to change the secondary plan that was basically originally going to hand over the entire downtown downtown core to developers, to one that included Section 37 bonusing for social housing on anything over a certain height. It allowed them to talk about rental displacement policy built into the Hamilton master plan, so that if an apartment building was being taken down that you used to have rental units, that there were some provisos and some city power to do that. Now, this hasn't come into effect, but it's something that we were able to leverage on a small scale to get developers and the city and city staff specifically to stop looking at Hamilton as this provincial city where we need to do everything we can to developers, to talking about community benefits and talking about what we can get out of these dollars flowing in to grow our city. So that is the Section 37, but we're also looking beyond that. We're looking at maybe actually asking private sector employers to employ 1 to 5% of trades and marginalized people through the same pipeline that we're looking at doing with the LRT system. So that's in short, is basically the status that we're at. Now, unfortunately, LRT has become a little bit of a political football in Hamilton, as it does every time there's a municipal election. So everything is, as I said, is on hold, pending hopefully a council that is more progressive and more supporting of both community benefits and the project itself before I can give you any more of an update. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering your questions later.